This weekend, the latest Zack Snyder film, Rebel Moon Part 2, The Scargiver, dropped on Netflix. So today I'm going to stop and rank all 11 Zack Snyder films from the worst to the best. Hi, my name is Sean, and I love to talk about movies and TV way too much. With that in mind, go ahead and join me down below in the comments section. Share your ranking of Zack Snyder's films. My list is not the right list. It's just my list, and I would love to see yours. Now, I'm a big fan of Zack Snyder as a director because he's a director that actually has a distinct voice, perspective, and style. Whether you love him or hate him, Zack Snyder makes movies in a style that elicits a response from viewers, and we need more directors like that, and he happens to make a lot of movies that are very much my kind of thing. With that said, let's get started. Coming in last place, Rebel Moon Part 1, The Child of Fire, PG-13 version. Now, this was a movie that I was very excited to check out because on paper, everything about it sounded pretty great to me.
The origins of Rebel Moon, I think it was up at Art Center when I was a student. I had a class on, you had to do like a one-line pitch, you know? And I was like, what about Dirty Dozen, Seven Samurai, but in space? And my professor was like, that's actually good.
And the way that he described it very much sounds like my kind of thing. And unfortunately, it turned out to be a massive disappointment. And the big reason for that is the movie just felt too derivative, too cyclical, and didn't add anything new or interesting to the genre. The basic idea of Magnificent Seven, Seven Samurai, Dirty Dozen in space sounds good, but it's also something that's been done before in Battle Beyond the Stars, sort of in an episode of The Mandalorian, and then even feels kind of like the plot of A Bug's Life. Feels like we've seen that before, and there's just not much new here. And just as a standalone movie in and of itself, this one feels like it's 80% middle act, where so much of the runtime is dedicated to going to a planet, introducing a character's cool thing, going to the next planet, introducing a character and their cool thing, going to the next planet, and it just repeats that cycle for the entire middle of this film. And as we move into the third act, we don't even use each of these characters' cool thing in the third act. And the strangest thing about the Rebel Moon movies is that each of these two parts feels like they're missing an hour that's needed for them to fully work. And at the same time, it doesn't feel like it makes any sense that they split this story into two movies. It feels like it should be like 1 2.5 hour movie, but in their current form, they are a massive disappointment. Number 10, Rebel Moon Part 2, The Scargiver. Now, I think that this one is marginally better than Part 1, simply because the third act is more exciting, it's bigger, and because it's closing out the conflict that was established at the beginning of Part 1, it's a bit more satisfying when you get to the end. But I also think that this movie is a derivative mess with nothing to offer the genre as a whole. The entire idea for why Rebel Moon stuck in his head for decades was trying to see how far it could go.
I kept coming back to it because I really had something to say about the sort of tropes of sci-fi. There's got to be a why of it, and how do we break it?
And in those exact same interviews, he talks about how the Rebel Moon that he originally wrote was intended to push the boundaries of sci-fi.
In the R-rated versions of the movie, everything is amplified. The R-rated versions of the movie have a slightly more satirical, they don't have sort of sex and violence to over the top them. That in the R-rated versions, because the violence is so over the top and the sex is so over the top, that the tone changes.
And then the original version that he released for each of these films cut all of that out and was PG-13. Or as he called it, it's the earnest version.
The PG-13 movies end up being pretty earnest, where I feel like in the PG-13, it's just more straightforward.
The original version released is the watered-down version to appease Netflix.
It's kind of ironic. So I wrote this very extreme R-rated bizarro sci-fi movie to test it.
Right.
But now you've gotten the earnest version first. I'll deconstruct my own movie with the director's cut. So
that's hysterical.
It's a closed loop.
Everything that he wanted to add to the genre by pushing its boundaries, being a little bit satirical, has been cut out, and you're just getting this earnest, extremely derivative version of Rebel Moon that has no purpose for existing besides so that Netflix would allow him to make the R-rated version. He had to pull himself out of it and just put out a cover of Star Wars. A bad cover of Star Wars at that.
I just saw Rebel Moon Part 2. There's nothing in there that's safe.
Yeah.
And I saw the PG-13.
Yeah, PG-13 is a joke.
Number 9, Sucker Punch. If you're gonna make a bad movie, at least make an interesting bad movie. And I would say that Sucker Punch is an interesting and memorable bad film. And it might be the best looking, or at least the coolest looking, bad movie of all time. I mean, you got a film with massive mech samurai, mechs with miniguns battling World War I prop planes. I mean, it is just filled with wild, crazy Zack Snyder imagery. I can respect the ambition of what he was going for here. This feels like pure Zack Snyder, but he definitely was not able to pull off his ambitions here. The real world plot in the movie is essentially a psychological thriller about a girl unjustly put in a mental institution. But the story plays out through a series of fantasies inside of fantasies, which is, it's interesting, it's different, it's certainly unique, but it's kind of tough to sit through a movie that's essentially 2 levels deep into fantasy in just a series of visual metaphors. Amazing visual metaphors, but it also kind of plays out like a 2-hour-long music video. I mean, multiple segments of this movie overtly play like a music video because they have like these cover songs playing while you have a series of images without dialogue happening. It's an extreme example of style over substance. All the stunning action sequences are essentially a metaphor inside of a fantasy, which itself is a creative visualization of the previous week's events. Or at least that's my interpretation of what's happening here.
There's a lot of unfinished business I have with that movie. That's like the only movie I've made that really sort of exists in that way, where I never really realized what I was intending.
Next up, Legend of the Guardian, The Owls of Ga'Hoole. And for all the obvious reasons, this is kind of the odd one out in Zack Snyder's filmography. It's a PG movie about talking owls, and it's entirely animated. And for that reason, it falls into this very odd space in his filmography. It is a family film, but it also has that Zack Snyder aesthetic and viciousness to it. And I think ultimately that's the movie's biggest problem, that trying to combine those two things together doesn't really work, and I don't think it creates a movie that is for either one of its audiences. I showed it to my kids a few years back when I watched it for the first time, not knowing what it was, and traumatized my daughter because it's so harsh, vicious, and violent. But if you want to watch a violent Zack Snyder film, you don't immediately go, let's go to the Talking Owl movie. And I think there's just a disconnect in tone there, where there's just a very clear example of the wrong person directing a specific story. And what he does well, what he brings to a project, does not complement a story like this. There's even some very dramatic, bizarre tonal moments where it kind of is bookended by these cutesy moments of owls telling these stories. 2 different occasions in the movie, an Owl City song pops onto the screen, and if you're making a movie called The Owls of Ga'Hoole, sure, let's put some Owl City in there. But when I think about the music that matches the Zack Snyder aesthetic, Owl City and its catchy, poppy, syrupy sweetness is about as far away from Zack Snyder as I can imagine. And that's the disconnect of this film, that he's just the wrong guy to make a family film, and therefore it's overly harsh. Today's video is brought to you by BetterHelp. In life, it's so easy to get so wrapped up in the urgent that we're just reacting to everything happening all around us, and we never stop to think, what will actually make me happy? And therapy can help you realize what you really care about and make that your priority. If you don't know my story, when I started this YouTube channel, I was unemployed and in an alcohol treatment program. I was just being crushed by the stress of life and turned to alcohol to cope with everything going on. I didn't know where to turn for help, and I wish that 12 years ago I had turned to therapy instead of alcohol. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online and designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists anytime for no additional charge. If you're struggling in life, you don't have to do it alone. There is help out there. Visit betterhelp.com/Sean Chandler today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/Sean Chandler. Number 7, Army of the Dead. And as a point of reference, the rest of the movies on this list I am a fan of. Some of them I love. And when it comes to Army of the Dead, I like this movie. I was really hoping to love this movie. There's a great concept in here, and the execution, unfortunately, holds it back from being as good as it should be. The basic idea here about a heist movie in Vegas set during a zombie apocalypse sounds fantastic. And a lot of this film delivers on the promise of that premise. In a lot of ways, it is a spiritual sequel to Dawn of the Dead.
I wrote the story like right after Dawn. I probably wrote the story in 2004. It had always been there because I could pitch it really easily. You know, it's like such an obvious thing. It's like, oh, there's a zombie outbreak in Vegas.
The montage of the fall of Las Vegas is awesome. There's a number of action set pieces in here where they're running through casinos with zombies everywhere. They're very cool. But there's all these other ideas that I don't think complemented the film. It's a movie that just has too many subplots. Zombie heist movie in Vegas is cool enough on its own. And then you add in some extra layers of mythology. Oh, sweet. Even better. But then you start overcomplicating things by having like these coyotes taking people into Vegas. And then on top of that, you add evil corporations with betrayals, all this stuff going on. And it gets so crowded that the fun and the appeal of heist movie in Vegas that has conflict and danger in and of itself gets lost in this convoluted mess of too many subplots, unfortunately. I do enjoy the movie overall, but it's a frustrating watch because you can easily imagine the better version of the film if Zack Snyder just handed off script duties to someone else that could have sorted through the good and the bad ideas. Number 6, Batman v Superman, Dawn of Justice, the Ultimate Edition. But this is a film that I've always had very conflicted feelings about because there's so much about it that I respect and also thoroughly enjoy, where it is very much a follow-up to Man of Steel, and it plays out where that movie ended and took the idea of what if Superman emerged in the world and extrapolates that. How would people respond? The stakes and conflicts are both personal as well as political, ideas that are philosophical being explored while also trying to tie into very human emotions. And you get some very cool Batman sequences, of course, the warehouse fight, but also even a lot of the dialogue between Bruce Wayne and Alfred. I love a bunch of those sequences, and it's the first time that we got to see the big trio from the DC. It's also a movie that just is trying to do too much and becomes very convoluted in the process. It feels like they were rushing a little bit too much to get Batman into the universe and get to a Justice League movie.
Was there a rush to kind of throw too many characters in there?
So. I think so. And I just think I know the pressure that we were getting from Warner Brothers was just we need our MCU.
It was pretty early in the process that we were like going to bring Batman into the movie. Once you say that out loud, like we should have Batman in the movie, it's hard to put that back in the that toothpaste back in the tube, you know? Because like they're like, well, we should have a cooler guy than Batman, and then that doesn't exist.
I was one of the people that was just saying, whoa, let's not run before we walk. Like, hold on. Like, they were very methodical in the way we built it. We just can't jump, into all of these things.
And so this movie feels like Man of Steel 2. It feels like Dawn of Justice. It feels like Batman v Superman. It feels like the death of Superman, all at the same time. And some of them connect properly and some of them really don't. But at the end of the day, this is a movie that I'm constantly drawn back to. It absolutely has many flaws, but I think it does a lot of things right, and I very much respect the ambition of the film. Next up, Dawn of the Dead, and I find it utterly fascinating that this movie was directed by Zack Snyder and written by James Gunn, and in the next 2 decades, both of them would get their turn being in charge of the DC universe. That sort of thing is just fascinating to me, the way things like that work out. But I'm someone that was a fan of the original Romero Dawn of the Dead before this film came out, and it ended up being just this very solid 21st century reimagining of Dawn of the Dead.
I felt like the tone was really interesting to me, this kind of combination of have fun but don't make fun. Be reverent to the genre, but also push it.
Now, it doesn't have the built-in metaphors and allegory of the Romero film about society already being zombies to consumerism, but it replaces all of that with just being this great, high-energy, high-octane zombie movie with very stylized action, a lively set of characters that make for a great ensemble where each of them has their own place in the film. Each of them brings an interesting dynamic. They're all funny or have a great character arc in their own ways, where like CJ, who you hate at the beginning of the movie, turns out to be like your favorite character by the end of it. And he's still the same guy, but they just have him go through enough scenarios and do enough things that the same qualities that made him horrible make him awesome by the end of it. But when you have a movie that has kind of James Gunn's ability to pull together a ragtag group, an ensemble together with Zack Snyder visuals in a fun genre, you get something that stands the test of time. And while it is a remake, it's a movie that is solid on its own terms, and one of the great horror remakes of all time, and one of the best zombie movies of all time. Number 4, Watchmen, the director's cut. Watchmen is a very interesting film in that it's an adaptation of what is probably the most celebrated graphic novel of all time. And at the point in time the graphic novel came out, it was this deconstruction of 50 years of comic book movie lore. And for decades, it was considered unfilmable. But beyond that, you have Zack Snyder as a director who would go on to do the iconic superheroes that would eventually be, that were deconstructed in this film before he did those movies, as well as many people, including Christopher Nolan, has said that this movie was ahead of its time by about 10 years, where the comic book movie genre hadn't matured enough for a film like Watchmen to actually be able to comment on the comic book movie genre itself. If Watchmen came out 10 years later, right after Endgame, suddenly it's a deconstruction of the most popular genre and franchise of the previous decade. But when it came out, it was just ahead of all of that. And it was deconstructing something in a medium where it had not been constructed yet.
The movie that's probably was made 10 years before it should have been made, based on what it says about the genre. You know, I was making it based on this comic book genre, right? Not the movie genre necessarily, but the movies have caught up to it.
Now, I've read the graphic novel probably about 4 times over the last 20 years. And I feel like if you're gonna try and do a translation of it into a film, besides a few Zack Snyder isms that are a little bit too prominent, it's a pretty accurate version of that, and that's very much what Zack Snyder wanted to do.
The process that I went through when I said I would do it was kind of trying to reinsert as much of the graphic novel back into it as possible.
Watchmen is inherently a bit of a tough sell as a blockbuster because it it is so bleak. All of the conventions of the genre, it flips them on their head. But that's also everything that makes it so fascinating. I don't know that everything properly translates. I think that some things in film form, it's just too dense to where I think something does get lost in translation to some extent. But just because it's not as good in a different medium doesn't mean it's not good as a film. Real quick before I give you my top 3, remember to join me down below in the comment section. Share your ranking of Zack Snyder's films. Also, if you want more detailed thoughts on some of his films, over the course of my channel, I've reviewed a number of his films, and then I've tried to play catch up on some of the other ones over the last month, such as Dawn of the Dead 300 and Sucker Punch. I'll pin a comment down below with my reviews of each of those films. In third place, Man of Steel, the movie that kicked off the DCEU, though it wasn't really intended to kick off the DCEU. In fact, where the movie came about was during the writing process of The Dark Knight Rises.
The legend is that Man of Steel came out of writer's block on Dark Knight Rises.
That's true.
We had writer's block. I had some old Superman action comics. Just started reading them and just spent a couple hours randomly writing up a take.
David Goyer comes up with this idea for a Superman movie.
I told it to him, and he said, I would produce that if you want. He literally called up Jeff Robinoff, then head of Warner Brothers, said, Goyer's got the Superman take. I think you should hear it.
But decides he doesn't think he's the right person to direct it?
My friend Christopher Nolan called me and said, would you have any interest in making a Superman movie? David Goyer and I wrote a Superman script, and I don't think I want to do it.
And all of a sudden, the DCEU is born, in which case you have a movie that has the writing of David Goyer, the guy that wrote the Dark Knight trilogy, with a story from Christopher Nolan, one of the top working directors today, and with the directorial style and visuals and visceralness of Zack Snyder. Put those all together, and I think you get something special. Now, this is very much a 21st century reimagining of Superman. When I first watched the film, it caught me very off guard because it's so different from the Superman that I grew up with. But every time I watch it, I appreciate it a little bit more and accept it on its own terms. I think it does a great job of creating a mythology surrounding him. The score is fantastic. I love a lot of the little moments between Henry Cavill and Amy Adams. And then you have a movie that has that Zack Snyder action. You finally get to see Superman really punching someone in the face, and you feel it, and did something fresh, new, and different. And so for me, this is like a special film. Our runner-up, 300. Sometimes I talk about movies as being spicy food, and what I mean by that is that people that like spicy food love spicy food and they want everything to be spicy. But then there's people that don't like spicy at all. So anything with even a little bit of spice, they can't tolerate. And I think 300 is almost the perfect example of that, to where it's so distinct in its style, it's so distinct in its view of heroism.
This is where they die, and these shields fight!
That the people that are into what this movie offers love it. And a bunch of other people are like, I don't like that at all. And I think that's so often what art is supposed to do. It's supposed to make an impact. Zack Snyder had wanted to adapt it for a while, and he'd had this idea in his head of like, I just want to translate the graphic novel straight into a movie.
When I said it's gonna look just like the comic book, they were like, yeah, but where in Greece are we filming? I'm like, we're not filming in Greece. We're filming just against the green screen. We're not even gonna shoot it outside. And they were like, what? Okay, you're nuts. And I go, yeah, we're not gonna go for one shot outside. And they were like, what? No, that's gonna be horrible.
Eventually he got to make the movie, and he did exactly what he said he was trying to do, of directly translating a graphic novel to the big screen. And immediately, as soon as the trailer released, it looked and felt different. In fact, Zack Snyder has recalled stories about how Tom Cruise saw the trailer for the movie.
I'd met him once over at his house to talk about, because he'd seen the trailer for 300 and was like, this is awesome. And I just kind of tell him how he did it, and everything was really, he's a sort of student of cinema and student of film, so he really wanted to know what this was.
Frequently, I criticize movies for being shot entirely in front of green screen, and this is an example of how to do it right, where Zack Snyder had a clear vision in his head, and the way to capture that vision was using green and blue screens. And thus, the movie looks stylistically consistent. It looks the way that it's supposed to look. It has a clear idea of how it wants to portray the Spartans, their aesthetic, their muscularity, what they wear.
This is Sparta!
And even as it gets into the action, which is very chaotic, but even in the midst of all of that, it's able to focus in on what matters. And Snyder uses all of the tricks that he has, whether the slow-mo, the way that it cuts between, like, he would shoot scenes with two different cameras so he could, like, zoom in and zoom out really quickly in the middle of action to make sure you're focused on exactly the right thing. It's a movie that is unique amongst films. It's a perfect version of what it's going for. That thing is not for everyone, but it's absolutely for me. But coming in at number 1, Zack Snyder's Justice League. Some people have asked me why I don't include the theatrical cut in this ranking, despite the fact that I include it in my DCEU rankings. The simple reason for it is that Zack Snyder did not direct that version of the film. He's never even seen that version of the film.
The version of Justice League that was created in my absence. Only suffice it to say that when my wife and Chris saw the movie, they told me never to watch it.
I watched this for the first time and was just immediately wowed by it. And I went, that is a true superhero epic with a story that's massive in scope, scale, and size, that takes its time to build out each individual character, give them a character arc that sets up a series of things to have massive payoff in the third act of the film. And I was immediately struck by the fact that every single change that they made for the theatrical version made the movie worse. Every time I rewatch it, just like feel like you're watching something special, something different that has weight to it.
I don't care how many demons he's fought and how many hells. He's never fought us. Not us united.
And when it has such a big runtime for such a big story, you feel like you've been on a journey with the characters by the end of it. So everything feels satisfying as you piece it together as the story is told. So for me, this is a movie that I absolutely love. I am still amazed that it was allowed to be released in such a complete form. And I am so grateful that that was something that was able to happen. And so for me, it comes in at number 1. If you enjoyed this video, I've done other director rankings just like this one. You can check those out in that playlist right over there. You can check out my other Zack Snyder reviews right down there. Thank you so much for watching, and keep talking movies and TV.